and welcome to ATV. I'm Suad Asfour. My guest tonight is Salem Ajluni. Salem is a native of Detroit, Michigan, but grew up in San Jose. He studied economics at San Jose State University and the University of Utah and taught college a decade during the 1980s and the 1990s. In 1996, Ajluni took a job as a UN economist in Gaza and resided and worked there for the next 5 years. After 2001 and for the next 18 years, Ajluni worked as a consultant for a number of United Nations agencies operating in Southwest Asia. These consultancies took him back to Palestine as well as to Jordan, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Ajluni served on the board of directors of the Arab Americans Culture Center in San Jose during 2013 through 2015, and on the board of Amman Charitable Foundation in San Jose during 2016 through 2020, an organization initiated to assist Arabic-speaking refugees residing in Northern California. Since 2017, he has been a member of the Santa Clara County Single Payer Healthcare Coalition and has participated in a number of local and national electoral campaigns in support of progressive candidates. Salem, welcome to the show and thank you for coming.
Thanks for your kind invitation.
Oh, thank you. We've been waiting for this for a long time. We've been looking forward to have you on the show. Salem, I know there's a lot to talk about, and you are rich with information that we would like to grab from you. I would like to start by asking you if you can give us just a brief history about Palestine since 1948, basically during the Nakba, from the Nakba until now, and we want to see where is this going to.
Yeah, well, the Palestine question or the Palestine conflict began in the 20th century at the end of World War I.
Yes.
When British and French colonial governments moved into the Eastern Mediterranean and took control of lands that were previously part of the Ottoman Empire, which was defeated in the First World War, and which was an ally of the Axis of Germany in the First World War. So as part of the spoils of war, the French and the British moved into the area, and the British took control in particular of the area we know as Palestine, and what we know as Transjordan or Jordan, and the area, the country that we call Iraq today. And borders were established for these things, and individual colonial governments were established in these places. And in Palestine, they established what was called the British Mandate, according to the agreements made by the big powers after World War I. At the same time, the British had made an agreement with the Zionist movement in Europe, and in particular the British Zionist movement, to establish what they call the homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And this led to conflicts and contradictions in British policy, British colonial policy. But what it meant was that the British supported the establishment of institutions and organizations within the Jewish community in Palestine, which was very small at the time, and also assisted in migration of European Jews
and settlements
to Palestine, and of course the building of housing and the provision of land and water resources to that influx of Jews coming from Europe in the 20s and 30s, and especially in the 40s after the rise of fascism in Europe and the assaults on Jews, amongst others, in Europe during that period. And so, the result of that was that the Jewish community in Palestine was able to organize what you might call parastatal or pre-state institutions and organizations that allowed it to break free, in a sense, of the British control and to establish its own authority, its own government in
For
Palestine.
themselves.
Yeah, but in so doing, physically displaced about 3/4 of the total Palestinian population in the era that's called the Nakba, and it runs from around 1947 to 1949, roughly, over a 2-year period. A whole series of battles, massacres, campaigns operated by mostly the pre-state Jewish militias and organizations that the British fostered in the 30 years before the establishment of the State of Israel, and they were capable of physically displacing and dispossessing 3/4 of the Palestinian population. Many of them, of course, those people became refugees. Some remained behind what Israeli lines after 1948. But the majority of them were expelled to areas not under Israeli control, to the West Bank, which became administered by Jordan, to the Gaza district, which became administered by Egypt after 1948. And so, and until 1967, for the next 20 years or so, those two parts of the former Palestine were administered by Jordan on the one hand, Egypt on the other. And of course, there were Palestinians expelled to Syria and to Lebanon and places further afield. Many ended up in Kuwait and the Gulf and in Gulf countries. Some ended up in the Americas. Some ended up in Australia, all over the world. So there's a Palestinian diaspora that stems from this period that we call the Nakba, that roughly is the period 47 to 49 or 48. And so during this period, of course, the West Bank was administered by Jordan, which was ruled and still is ruled by a monarch, a relatively conservative and relatively authoritarian system of rule, and also one that sort of repressed Palestinian aspirations to resist Israel and to combat in a way, or to get back from Israel what they had lost in Palestine. Likewise, the Egyptian government in the early 50s, before the revolution of the Jamal Abdel Nasser's revolution in Egypt, likewise that was a British-controlled or British-influenced government, just like the Jordanian government, and they were not interested in allowing Palestinians to try to get back what they lost. And so there was a certain amount of repression, but after in Gaza in particular, but that's the long and short of it. That the Palestine conflict and the Palestine refugee situation stems from the emergence of the Zionist movement, its alliance with British colonialism, and we're talking about 20th century colonialism.
Yes.
The odd thing about Palestine is that Palestine was colonized at the time when many countries around the world were just beginning to become decolonized, including just around 48, 49, India, won its independence from Britain, which was the largest colony of the British, broke away from Britain around the time that Palestine was becoming colonized. And so Palestine is a very late case of European colonization, with the added dimension of having a settler colonial entity or system imposed within that colony.
Yes.
So if the earliest British colony is Ireland, you might say one of the latest, or perhaps the latest British colony, was Palestine. And in its place came a settler colonial system that was enabled, that was supported, and that was fostered by British colonialism. And that's basically what Israel, what the state of Israel is today. And of course, Israel has expanded its borders to include now everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and has also occupied a portion of Syria, the Golan Heights. And so that's really a nutshell. I encourage people to use search engines if they're interested in Palestinian history, the history of Palestine, to find primers in Palestinian history, a Palestine 101 type of primer. And you can find those, Rashid Khalidi, perhaps you can find under the name Rashid Khalidi, under the name of Phyllis Bennis, who's also an important scholar, who has written primers in the past on Palestine, which are very useful. I recommend that to,
Yeah.
to the audience who
A lot of
wants a little bit
people
more.
need
Yeah.
to know that, and
Yeah.
they need to know the truth. So since 1948, the Palestinians, they've been scattered all over the world, and now we're experiencing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And why is Gaza different? And I mentioned in the remark that you lived in Gaza for over 5 years. And we need to know more about why is this happening now,
Yeah.
and why is Gaza, is it the most dangerous city in the world now, or what's going on?
No, I wouldn't call it, well, if it is the most dangerous city in the world, it's not because of something that's generic to Gaza. It's something that's imposed on Gaza. In particular, there's
Yes.
there's an Israeli onslaught, a military siege on Gaza, and it's very intense. It's probably, when all is said and done, people will see this episode that started in early October of 2023 as probably the second most intense episode of physical violence against a people by an outside power after the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Probably this will be recorded in history as the second most intensive assault on civilian population in the history of the
October
world,
7.
actually, in the history of the world, and that's saying a lot, given that the German Nazi regime invaded Eastern Europe and really pulverized and bombed cities and cities like Stalingrad, but even those cases are turning out to be not as intense in general as what the Israelis are doing in Gaza today. But if I just step back a bit, I would say that, as I said, the Israelis occupied the remainder of historic Palestine in 1967, and that means they occupied Gaza and the West Bank. They imposed a military occupation there. So everybody who was born in these territories since 1967 or lived there since 1967 live under a military occupation. In the case of Gaza in particular, what's different about Gaza than the West Bank and a lot of places is that the very high proportion of the population is refugee. That is to say that 65 to 70% of the population of Gaza are the children, are themselves refugees, but mostly it's the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren who were displaced and dispossessed in 1948-49 who live in Gaza. So in the West Bank, for instance, only about 25% of the total population is refugee from Palestine, from the days of the Palestine Mandate, whereas in Gaza, it's 65 to 70%. And so
we can consider Gaza as a camp?
Yeah, I mean, there's an indigenous Gaza population, right? That's about 30% of the population that were always living in the area that we call Gaza today. But on top of that, the 200,000 or 230,000 or so refugees who landed in Gaza after 48-49, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren still live there, along with the original Gazans and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Yes.
And so, why is that different? Is because refugees are, number one, are displaced, and they're dispossessed, which means that they're propertyless. I mean, they arrive in Gaza and they arrive in the West Bank and they arrive everywhere with nothing. Whatever lands, properties, possessions that they owned in the former Palestine or in the Mandate Palestine, they lost. And so they ended up in refugee camps, and an agency of the United Nations called UNRWA, established in 1950, which still exists as a very, very large UN organization, has provided for the last 75 years, or so, schooling, health services, some social support for those populations. The UNRWA has operations in 5 fields, including Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and the West Bank and Gaza. The biggest operations they have are in Gaza because the vast majority of the population is refugee.
Yes.
And has access to those. So, so Gaza is different in the sense that it's the poorest, a very poor area, and it's poor because it's the generation that was dispossessed bequeathed poverty or relative poverty to subsequent generations, right?
Wow.
So when you take away the possessions and the property from a generation, of course, in subsequent generations, people work and buy land and buy homes or accumulate some amount of money and wealth, but they've had a setback, a serious setback that has intergenerational implications.
Yes.
And in the case of Gaza, that means it's a poor population.
Yeah.
So what we know historically about poor populations is that those who have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
And because they have nothing to lose, and because Gaza was, I think, its relationship to Egypt for 20 years, and to the political currents that were strong in Egypt, like the Arab nationalist movement that was ushered in or existed in Egypt for a long time, but the coup that overthrew the British rule in Egypt in 1952-53 and brought Jamal Abdel Nasser to power, that current, that political current, had its impact on Gaza because Gaza was administered by Egypt for 20 years. So they had this more radical political culture, partly because of their relationship to Egypt, which was being led by a revolutionary nationalist type of regime, government. In addition, Egypt was the home of the Muslim Brotherhood, starting in the 1920s. So Gaza was also then exposed to, in a very direct way, the emergence of political Islam in the region. So you have that current as well. And as well, there were Marxist and communist trends within Egyptian society, and those were reflected in Gaza because whoever could make it to Cairo, whatever families could afford to send their children to universities, to schools in Cairo, were exposed to all of those trends, and they brought those with them back to Gaza. So Gaza had extreme poverty, plus a sort of a radical or radicalized political culture through its relationship to Egypt and the developments in Egypt, and in the broader world. Egypt as a member of the non-aligned movement was in contact with the revolutions of Algeria, the revolution of Vietnam, the revolution of China, and the non-aligned movement, of which Egypt was an important part, was in contact and in conversation and in dialogue with all of those trends worldwide, and those things were, part of Egyptian political culture and therefore part of Gaza's political culture. And so when Gaza was occupied in '67 by the Israelis, the resistance to that occupation was a politicized resistance and an intense resistance.
It's still going on till today.
Yeah. Well, look at it this way. Gaza has always been, I think, in the modern period, a more radical place politically, largely because of its poverty, its extreme poverty, and also because of its political culture and its exposure to those political trends. But also that Israeli repression has been particularly strong against
Taking
Gaza.
over, yeah.
Even in the 1980s, when I first visited Palestine in the 1980s, everyone knew when I visited and stayed with students and stayed on the campus of Birzeit University in the West Bank, there were Gazan students there. This was in the 1980s. This was before Hamas ever existed. This was before, there was an intifada before, but there was a PLO, right? And
The Palestinian Authority was in control?
no, they
that time?
never. No, there was no.
No?
No, there was no political. There was an Israeli occupation. I'm talking about the
Oh.
period of in the 80s. The Palestinian Authority wasn't established until 1993, 94, in Gaza and parts of
And
the West
when
Bank.
did Hamas won the election?
Hamas
Was
won
it
the
in
election.
the
The election in 2006. The
2005? Okay,
legislative
6.
elections in 2006.
Yeah.
But
See, but they won. I mean, they won by election.
yeah, they
That's how I
won the
look at
election
it.
in Gaza and the West Bank for the legislature. It
Right.
wasn't the presidential election; it was the legislative elections. But if you go back a bit, even in those days in the 80s, before there was a Palestinian Authority, before there was an Intifada, Israeli repression was more strongly directed at Gazans than it was against West Bankers, and I knew this
Yeah.
because whenever we were with students and we were going to on a bus to a place with the students, and we were stopped at a checkpoint, the Gaza students would immediately
Oh.
go to the back of the bus and hide
So they were treated differently.
because they knew their identity cards that
They
are
have
issued
different
by
colors.
the Israelis have a different color, and they knew that that the Israelis would give them a hard time because they're Gazans, even though they had every right to be in the West Bank and every right to be at the university. But they knew that because they were Gazans, they would be the Israelis would have more suspicions
Yeah.
of them, and
Poor
so
thing.
it was always the case that Gazans were differentially treated, and the repression against Gazans was always more direct and more thorough than against
So,
people in the West Bank.
What do you think of Hamas' vision right now?
Well, what has happened since the Oslo process and since the Second Intifada broke out in 2000 is that Gaza's resistance to continuing Israeli settlements and presence in Gaza after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. I'm talking about now the year
Yes.
2000. This is 7 years after 7 years after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. The Second Intifada broke out. And the Second Intifada broke out because of the breakdown of the Oslo process, the so-called peace process, because it became clear to Palestinians that the Israelis were not interested in the minimal international consensus solution to the Palestinian problem, which at that time was the establishment of a Palestinian state, the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, where Palestinians would have their own government.
That was during the time Yasser Arafat
Yes.
met in
Yes,
Washington.
yeah. So this is after '93.
And now they don't talk about it
Yeah,
no
yeah,
more.
yeah. So anyway, that process broke down, and violence emerged against
over again.
continuing Israeli confiscation of land and placing settlers in occupied territory in the West Bank and Gaza. They still had settlements in Gaza at that point, and they still had military presence in Gaza even up to 2000. Well, Hamas and others took up arms against Israel in Gaza and in the West Bank, and for 2 years, for 2 years, 3 years, there were pitched battles in both places. The resistance was so strong in Gaza that and partly it's because of Hamas. The emergence of Hamas as a major military had a major military component. They were striking at settlers in Gaza. They decided that they would pull their settlements out of Gaza and pull their presence out of Gaza and seal the borders. They had been building borders around Gaza since the early 90s anyway. So they pulled their people out of there and closed the borders of Gaza and basically made Gaza a sort of isolated island with no independent access to the rest of the world, neither by sea,
Not even
neither
going to
by
Egypt
airport,
or
which
anywhere,
they destroyed.
or
They
Jordan.
destroyed the airport, and the Egyptian government was collaborating with the Israelis on that to restrict access Rafah and the Egyptian Gaza crossing
Gate.
and so Gaza became sort of an isolated place, and subsequently in 2007, when the Hamas won the election, there was a divide for a period of about 5 years between the West Bank Palestinian Authority and the
And
Palestinian
Hamas.
Authority in Gaza. Hamas wasn't in power per
Oh.
se, but Hamas was a growing force in Gaza. There was still a Palestinian Authority in Gaza until 2005, 2006.
Oh, yeah.
And then they decided to have elections, right? To have elections for the legislature. They had presidential elections in 2005, and after Yasser Arafat died in 2004, Mahmoud Abbas was elected. The Fatah candidate was elected. The next year in 2006, they had the legislative elections, and the legislative elections were won by Hamas in both the West Bank and
Right.
Gaza.
Yes.
Those elections were overturned in the West Bank by Palestinian Authority Fatah, Israeli military and intelligence, along with the CIA. They would not allow they arrested all of the Hamas candidates who won the legislative election. They arrested them and they put them in jail. So they annulled, in a sense, the elections there. They tried to do the same in Gaza, but Hamas, as a military force, had meanwhile has a military force. They were able to block that, and so Hamas remained in power. They won the election, and they remained in power in Gaza, and the two governments became like separate governments, and the Israelis were fine with that. In fact, the Israelis during this period after 2006, 2007, were quite keen on Arab countries like Qatar providing money to Hamas to bolster Hamas, because they knew that, or they thought that having Hamas strong in Gaza and Fatah strong in the West Bank, there would never be a Palestinian unity, and there would never be somebody with what the Israelis would refer to as a viable partner
Yeah.
to negotiate peace with, right?
Yes.
And this was something that Netanyahu bragged about, and he brags about it still today,
Yes.
that he prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state. He prevented an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement.
Of course.
And partly it was the existence of two different political factions and weights in West Bank and Gaza. So that's the sort of political history. Yeah. And since 2007, when Hamas won in 2006, the coup, the attempted coup against them in Gaza was foiled, and Hamas retained power or assumed power in Gaza. There have been a whole series of Israeli incursions, in addition to the fact that the Israelis have sealed the borders of Gaza, not allowing people out or people in without their permission, without Israeli permission, created a real hardship for Gaza. Prior to this period, there were tens of thousands of Gazans working in Israel, for instance. And for much of the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were tens of thousands of Gazans working in Tel Aviv on a daily basis, going back and forth. And they were earning incomes, good incomes relative to what you could earn in Gaza.
So they were in good terms, no conflict?
No, there was conflict, but I mean, the Israeli system benefits from the labor of Gazans and the labor of West Bank Palestinians, because it's cheap labor, relatively speaking.
Of
right?
course, yeah.
So in agriculture, in services, especially in construction, the construction of settlements, the construction of Tel Aviv, the construction of Israeli towns, lots of construction workers, especially from Gaza, were working in Israeli construction sites inside Israel, and even inside the occupied territories, even building settlements, believe it or not.
Yep.
So anyway, this came to a halt as the Israelis restricted movement out of Gaza. This increased unemployment, increased poverty in Gaza. And so after 2007, the situation became even more dire. And this raised conflicts between Hamas and between the Israeli authorities. And there were a whole series in 2008 and 9, in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, and then in 2021, 2018 as well, there were cross-border conflagrations, fighting between Israeli and Hamas forces, which were slowly building up their capacities to defend themselves, in Gaza. And you have to the point today that we're now 75 days.
Today is 75 days.
Today is the 75th day of the Israeli assault on Gaza, which began on October 7th. And, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. And before the sun set on October 7th, the Israelis were already bombing, massively bombing. Were on the same day, has started their bombing campaign against Gaza, and it's a campaign that has not stopped to this day. And as I said earlier, it's a very intense. They're bombing civilian targets on a regular basis.
But where is the human rights?
Yeah. Well, yeah. This is precisely right. And what's so ironic is that the U.S. that supports and underwrites and provides the material means to Israel to engage in this, there's no outcry at an official level about the war crimes that are being committed using U.S. resources. And there are laws in the U.S. that say that U.S. government does not provide military assistance to those actors engaged in war crimes or engaged in attacking civilians particularly. But in this case, in the case of Israel, there's unlimited assistance, the use of U.S. taxpayer dollars, to help Israel basically bomb a tightly, a very small territory. The entire Gaza Strip is smaller than the city of San Jose, right?
Wow.
So the city of San Jose is 180 roughly square miles, and the Gaza is roughly 140 square miles. So you're talking about a geographic area that's smaller than San Jose, and a population that's more than twice the size of San Jose. So it's very dense, and it's civilians. I mean. People say that the Hamas and the other factions that are fighting alongside Hamas in Gaza today might be 30 or 40,000 people, might be 50,000 people. Let's say there are 100,000, but in a population of 2.3 million, 100,000 is
a big number.
Is a very small percentage of the population, and so the people who are being killed way disproportionately are civilians. They're bombing civilian areas to try to get to Hamas fighters and Jihad Islami fighters and other fighters from other factions. But what they're doing is they're killing thousands and maiming and wounding thousands of civilians
and women.
in a bid to basically to reorder Gaza, to make Gaza a quiet Israeli occupied or Israeli controlled zone where they can continue the myth and the fable that Israel is a democratic state, that the Palestinians don't want peace, that the Palestinians are not a partner for peace, that really they don't count. In fact, the language that's being used, that has been used since October 7th, is a repeat of 2014. If you remember 9 years ago when another major Israeli assault on Gaza, which was much smaller than the current one.
Right.
The same type of language and the same type of repression of voices in the U.S. that would speak out against it and would call it what it is. It's a military occupation. It's what the military occupation is engaged in is not self-defense, it's war crimes, because by law, Palestine or the occupied territories are just that, they're occupied territories. And the people in those territories, by international law, under the rules of international law, are occupied people who have a right to resist that occupation in whatever means that they have at their disposal. And it is not the case in international law that the occupying power has the right to self-defense. That's like saying the Russians in Ukraine who entered Ukraine illegally have a right to defend themselves from the Ukrainians.
I know.
By that logic, then,
Yeah.
then Germans who invaded Russia in the Second World War have a right to defend themselves when they are the occupying power.
What would you like to see different happening? We have 2 minutes left.
Oh.
What would you like to see different
Well,
after all this?
one thing is
experienced?
that people, and I'm not talking about just Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, but people in general here in San Jose, in California, and the country as a whole, have to speak out more and have to speak out in bolder ways and have to hold our government officials at every level responsible and hold their feet to the fire for what they are doing and what they are not doing.
Especially the one we elected.
Right, and to hold them accountable for what they're saying and what they're not saying. They're not saying these are war crimes. They're not saying this is a genocide. They're not calling for a ceasefire, even though 68% of the American population supports a ceasefire. You don't find 68% of our leaders calling for a ceasefire. It's a very small minority who are calling for a ceasefire,
Yes.
which tells us there's a mismatch. There's a disconnect between the popular base of society, which sees what's happening as a war crime, as a genocide, and is calling for a ceasefire, and those leadership, the leadership elite who are not.
And I call for ceasefire too.
Yeah.
We all
we have to raise our voices and
Right.
combine our voices in a chorus calling for ceasefire and an end to Israeli occupation.
Salem, this is so good. I wish we have more time. Unfortunately, we have to end the show, but hopefully we can have you another day to hear more of your information and experience. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate that, and I hope the best will happen for our country, Palestine. Thank you for watching us. Have a nice evening. Good night.